I thought my wife was protecting me from something dangerous. I was wrong. She was protecting something from me. The first sign was the locked drawer in her home office. We had always shared everything: finances, passwords, even our phones. So when I noticed she had changed the lock on the desk, I assumed it was work-related. Lately, she had been under stress at the hospital, staying late more often. I told myself she deserved privacy. Then came the phone calls. She started taking them in the laundry room. Not every time, but often enough that I noticed. Her voice would drop, tense and careful. When I walked in, she would end the call quickly and smile too fast, as if rehearsed. "It's just hospital administration," she said once. I wanted to believe her. After 12 years of marriage, belief is a habit. The real shift happened on a Thursday evening. I came home early with a migraine. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I found her sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of her. When she saw me, she startled and immediately slid the papers into a folder. "What are you doing home?" she asked. I felt awful. Took the afternoon off. She stood up and kissed my cheek, but her hands were cold. That night, while she showered, her phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't intend to look. It was habit to move it away from the edge. The screen lit up with a message preview. "We need to finalize the arrangement before Friday. He can't find out." My stomach tightened. The message wasn't from anyone I recognized. When she came out of the bathroom, I was sitting on the bed with her phone in my hand. "Who is this?" I asked. Her expression changed instantly. Not panic. Calculation. She sat down slowly. "It's about the property issue." "What property issue?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. "I didn't want to worry you." That line again. Always that line. She explained that a distant relative had left her a small inheritance, but there were legal complications. Someone was contesting it. The message, she claimed, was from her attorney, warning her that things needed to be handled quietly until everything was settled. It sounded plausible, but something felt off. The phrasing in the message didn't sound like legal language. Still, I told myself stress makes people paranoid. I apologized for invading her privacy. She seemed relieved, almost grateful. Over the next week, she became more attentive than ever, cooking my favorite meals, checking my blood pressure, reminding me to rest. It felt like she was trying to compensate for something. That only made my suspicion grow. Then I noticed the withdrawals. We had a joint account. I reviewed the statements out of routine budgeting. Small transfers at first, then larger ones, sent to an account under her maiden name. When I confronted her, she said it was for legal protection. She didn't want the funds tied to me in case the inheritance dispute escalated. But why would that matter? I asked. "We're married." She avoided my eyes. "Because they're watching." That sentence chilled me. Who is watching? She didn't answer directly. Instead, she said I needed to trust her, that she was handling something serious, that if anyone found out, it could affect my job. That was the first time she mentioned my job. I work in cybersecurity for a mid-sized financial firm. Nothing high profile, but sensitive enough. When she said that, a new fear entered my mind. Maybe this wasn't about money. Maybe someone was trying to use her to get to me. I started paying closer attention. One evening, I pretended to leave for work, but parked 2 streets away and returned quietly through the back entrance. I wanted to see if anyone was coming to the house. Instead, I found her in the office, the locked drawer open. She was photographing documents with her phone. When she heard me, she froze. "What are you doing?" I asked. She turned slowly. Her eyes were red, but not from crying. From exhaustion. "I can't tell you yet," she said. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not anger. Fear. "If you're in danger," I said carefully, "we handle it together." She shook her head. "If you're involved, it gets worse." Involved in what? Silence. She closed the drawer and locked it again, this time keeping the key in her pocket. That night, she slept facing away from me. I lay awake, listening to her breathing, trying to connect the pieces. The inheritance, the messages, the transfers, the secrecy, the warning that someone was watching. I replayed everything in my head. And then I remembered something small. 2 months earlier, a colleague had mentioned an internal audit at my firm. A minor security review triggered by unusual access patterns. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. But what if someone had accessed my credentials? What if the threat wasn't outside the house? What if it was already inside? To check something simple, I logged into our shared cloud storage from my laptop. I didn't expect to find anything unusual. Instead, I discovered a shared folder I didn't recognize. It was created under my name. Inside were copies of documents from my workplace, system architecture diagrams, internal email threads, access logs. My hands went numb as I scrolled. At the bottom of the folder, there was a note. If he asks, tell him it's for protection. He can't know the source. The timestamp was from 3 weeks ago. That was the moment I realized the truth was far worse than I imagined. I stared at the screen for a long time, waiting for the folder to disappear. It didn't. The files were real. The note was real. My name was on something I had never created. When my wife walked into the kitchen, I closed the laptop immediately. She looked at me carefully, studying my face the way she did when I had a migraine or a bad day at work. "You're pale," she said. I didn't sleep well. She poured coffee for both of us and sat across from me. For a moment, she seemed normal, warm, familiar. "I need to ask you something," I said. Her posture tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Okay. Is there anything on my work systems that shouldn't be there?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took a slow sip of coffee. "That's a strange question. I found a folder in our cloud storage. It contains internal documents from my company, created under my name." The silence stretched between us. "Finally," she said, "you shouldn't have looked." That wasn't a denial. My throat felt dry. "Did you upload those?" She hesitated. That hesitation confirmed everything. "Yes," she said quietly. I waited for her to explain. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Someone approached me." "Who?" "I can't give you a name yet. That's not how this works." Her eyes filled with frustration, not guilt. "They know about the audit at your company. They know about the vulnerabilities. They think you can access certain systems without triggering alerts. They wanted proof." "Proof of what?" "That you can do what they suspect." My heart pounded. "Suspect me of what?" She looked at me directly now. "They think you're being recruited by a competitor." The accusation hit like a physical blow. "I'm not," I said. "I know that," she replied quickly. "But they don't." She explained that a consulting firm had contacted her weeks ago, claiming they had evidence of suspicious activity linked to my credentials. They didn't want to report it yet. They wanted cooperation. They told her if she helped gather information quietly, they would ensure the issue disappeared without investigation. "That's why the messages were urgent," she said. "They needed the documents before the internal review escalated." "And you believed them?" "I believed they could destroy you." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. I stood up and paced the room. It didn't make sense. If there was suspicion at work, I would have been notified. Security protocols were strict. Unless someone was manipulating data before it reached me. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because they said if you knew, you'd react unpredictably. And if you contacted your company prematurely, it would look like guilt." She reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "That note in the folder," I said. "If he asks, tell him it's for protection." That sounds like a script. She didn't deny it. "They gave me instructions," she admitted. "They said you needed plausible deniability. If the documents were traced, they wanted it to look like an external compromise. So you helped them stage a breach." She flinched. "I was trying to protect you." The words hung in the air. I felt anger rising, but underneath it was something heavier. Betrayal mixed with fear. "Did you give them access to my accounts?" "No. Just copies of non-sensitive architecture files. Enough to satisfy their review. They said it was temporary." "And the money transfers?" Her shoulders dropped. "They paid for my cooperation." The room felt smaller. "How much?" She told me. It was more than I expected, but not life-changing. Enough to explain the transfers. "I didn't keep it," she added. "It's in a separate account. They insisted on it." "Who are they?" She shook her head. "They never met me in person. Everything was through encrypted channels. I only agreed because they had details about your internal projects. Things no outsider should know." That detail unsettled me. "Did they show you proof about the supposed competitor accusation?" "Yes. Screenshots of logs. But I don't know if they were real." My mind raced. If someone had fabricated evidence, they could be inside the system already. That meant this wasn't just about me. It was about access. I made a decision. "We're going to my workplace tomorrow," I said. "Together." Her eyes widened. "That wasn't part of the instructions." "I don't care." For the first time, she looked genuinely afraid. "They said if we escalate this, they'll release everything." "Everything about what?" She swallowed hard. "About you." I waited. She hesitated, then continued. "They claimed you had already been flagged once in a preliminary review last year." That was true. There had been a minor incident involving unusual login patterns, but it was resolved quickly. I had assumed it was a system glitch. They used that, she said. They said if this new information came out, it would look intentional. The pieces began aligning in a way that made my stomach twist. Someone wasn't trying to accuse me directly. They were constructing a narrative, and my wife had become the intermediary. Why tell me now? I asked. Her voice dropped. Because they changed the terms. They want more. More what? Access. She reached into her pocket and placed a small encrypted USB device on the table. They sent this yesterday. They said if you refuse to cooperate, I should use it. I stared at it. What does it do? I don't know exactly, but they said it would resolve the situation. That phrase echoed in my mind. Resolve the situation. Not protect. Resolve. I realized then that whatever she thought she was doing, she was no longer in control. Neither was I. And for the first time since this began, I understood that the real danger wasn't an accusation. It was manipulation. I didn't touch the USB device. I placed it inside a metal container we used at home for storing old hard drives, then locked it in the garage cabinet. My wife watched me the entire time, saying nothing. Did they tell you to bring it to me? I asked. Yes, she said, but only if you refuse to cooperate. And what exactly counts as cooperation? She hesitated again. That hesitation had become the pattern of our conversations. They want remote access, she finally said. They said you could install a diagnostic tool that would confirm the integrity of your systems. It would look harmless. I felt a cold clarity settling in. And in reality, they said it would help them identify the breach source. I nodded slowly. Or it would create one. She didn't respond. We sat in silence for a long time. The house felt different now, as if the walls had absorbed every secret we had spoken. Who contacted you first? I asked. She described the initial email, professional tone, company name that sounded legitimate, references to my firm's public infrastructure. They had known enough about internal projects to appear credible. They claimed to be conducting a private security audit on behalf of an unnamed client concerned about data exposure. They said you might be compromised, she added quietly. That someone could be using your credentials. That part is technically possible, I admitted. But that's why we have monitoring systems. They said your monitoring systems could be bypassed. That sentence lingered. I decided then that guessing would only deepen the trap. I needed facts, not emotions, not assumptions. I'm going to call our internal security lead, I said. She looked terrified. If you do that, they'll know. Let them. I stepped outside and made the call from the driveway. I kept it brief. I described the folder, the documents, the unknown creation, and the suspicious USB device. I didn't accuse anyone. I asked for verification. The response surprised me. My security lead paused when I mentioned the folder. That folder doesn't exist in our audit logs, he said. What do you mean? We've seen no external access matching that activity. A strange realization formed in my mind. If the folder wasn't created from outside, then it had to be created from inside our environment, either through compromised credentials or a mirrored session. He asked me to send screenshots. I did. Within minutes, he called back. There's something else, he said. Your account shows a secondary authentication token registered 3 weeks ago. I froze. I didn't register anything. That's what we're seeing. It's linked to an IP range associated with residential networks. My wife. When I walked back inside, she immediately saw my expression. They found something, she said. Yes. I explained about the secondary token. Her face drained of color. I didn't register anything, she insisted. They handled the setup. That detail changed everything. They accessed my account directly, I said. Through you. Her eyes widened. I didn't give them my password. They didn't need yours. The realization hit us simultaneously. If they convinced her to install anything on her device, or to approve authentication prompts under the pretense of verification, they could have used that to establish persistent access. She began shaking her head slowly. I only clicked what they sent. It looked like a verification portal. Show me. She retrieved her laptop with trembling hands. I examined the browser history. There were sessions routed through anonymized domains. But one link stood out. A redirect chain disguised as a secure validation page. It wasn't from a consulting firm. It was a phishing infrastructure built to mimic enterprise security tools. My heart sank. They weren't protecting me, I said. They were building leverage. Leverage was the key word. If they could fabricate evidence of internal data movement, then approach my wife with it, they could create pressure from both sides. The transfers, the documents, the scripts, everything had the structure of controlled manipulation. I called my company again, this time asking for a full forensic review. Within hours, the truth began emerging. There had been no internal suspicion of me, no competitor investigation. The supposed audit was non-existent. The documents I had found were copies pulled from a staging environment that mirrored certain public architecture files. The folder in our cloud storage had been created using credentials tied to the secondary token, the token that hadn't been authorized by me, meaning someone had used my wife's device to initiate access while impersonating enterprise verification protocols. When I told her this, she sat down slowly. "So they lied," she whispered. "Yes." She covered her face with her hands. "I thought I was preventing something." "You were." She looked up. "You prevented them from acting freely. Because once I escalated to internal security, everything shifted. They could no longer operate quietly. Logs were being preserved. Access was being traced. And the USB device in our garage now felt less like a tool and more like bait. "They will try to contact you again," I said. She nodded. We agreed to stop responding. No more encrypted channels. No more silent cooperation. The next day, my company's security team confirmed the attempt to introduce the secondary token came from a compromised third-party interface that had been temporarily connected during routine vendor maintenance. It had nothing to do with my integrity. It was a supply chain vulnerability. Someone had exploited it to create the illusion of internal misconduct. And they had targeted my wife because she was the easiest entry point. When the final report came in, my hands were steady. There was no accusation, no investigation, no mark on my record, but the emotional damage remained. That evening, my wife and I sat together in the living room. For the first time since this began, there were no secrets between us. "I thought I was protecting you from losing your job," she said. "I thought you were hiding something from me." She reached for my hand, and this time I didn't pull away. "We were both trying to protect each other," I said. She nodded. The truth was painful but simple. Fear had been exploited. Trust had been manipulated. And in trying to shield me from imagined consequences, she had unknowingly stepped into a trap designed to isolate us. The USB device was turned over to security as evidence. The accounts were closed. The external contacts disappeared once they realized we were no longer responding. It took time, but the tension slowly dissolved. What remained was something fragile but real. We learned that protection without transparency becomes vulnerability, and secrecy, even when motivated by love, can become the very tool used against you. My wife didn't hide because she was betraying me. She hid because she believed silence was safety. Now we know better. The official report should have ended everything, but it didn't end the fear. Even after the security team confirmed the supply chain exploit, I kept replaying the events in my head. The folder, the messages, the tone of the instructions, the way everything felt carefully structured, like a story built to pressure us. My wife was quieter after that week. Not distant, just thoughtful. She stopped taking calls in private rooms. She left her phone on the table. She stopped checking notifications with sudden tension. It was as if she was trying to relearn how to exist without suspicion. But something still bothered me. Who benefited from targeting us? The exploit had been real. The token had been created. The infrastructure used to fake the verification portal had been sophisticated. This wasn't random spam. It required planning. I asked my security lead one more question. Was anyone else targeted using the same method? There was a pause before he answered. Yes. 2 other employees reported similar unauthorized tokens during the same maintenance window. Different departments. That detail changed my understanding again. This wasn't personal. It was systemic. But then came the part that made my stomach tighten. One of those employees, he continued, resigned abruptly last month. Why? We don't know yet. After that call, I felt a new urgency. If someone had access to internal systems through compromised vendor infrastructure, they could quietly extract data without triggering alarms. My wife had been manipulated, but the underlying vulnerability still existed. That night, I told her everything. Not just the summary, the details, the maintenance window, the other affected accounts, the resignation. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said something I didn't expect. "I think they chose me because I'm close to you." Yes. But maybe that wasn't the only reason. I waited. "They asked about our routines," she said. about when you worked from home, about your travel schedule. They wanted to know when you were most distracted. The implication was clear. She wasn't random. She was profiled. That realization made me feel exposed in a different way. Not professionally, personally. For years, I had believed our life was ordinary, stable, predictable. That predictability had become a weakness. I asked her if she had saved any communication logs. She hesitated, then retrieved a secured backup she had made before we reported everything. She had intended to keep records just in case. We reviewed them together. As we read through the conversations, patterns emerged. The language was consistent. The tone shifted subtly over time. At first, they framed everything as protection. Then urgency increased. Then subtle threats appeared, never direct, but implied consequences if cooperation stopped. And then I saw something that made me sit back slowly. In one of the earliest messages, before the documents were mentioned, there was a line that didn't fit. Your husband's reaction will determine the outcome. I read it twice. They had assumed I would eventually discover the folder, which meant they expected me to investigate, which meant the entire setup was designed to trigger escalation. It wasn't just about data access. It was about testing response behavior. Do you think this was targeted at you specifically? She asked. Yes, I said, but not for the reason they told you. She looked confused. They didn't think I was recruiting for a competitor. That was just pressure language. The real goal was likely to measure how quickly internal security would respond once suspicion surfaced. Why would someone want that? To map defenses, I said. If someone wanted to breach a system, they would first test how threats were handled, who got notified, how fast logs were analyzed, whether employees escalated externally, whether personal devices were involved. My wife leaned back slowly. So I was part of a test. Yes. That realization hurt her deeply. I could see it. Not because she had done something wrong, but because she had trusted the wrong narrative. Over the next several days, we worked with security to audit every device in our home network. Nothing malicious remained. The USB device was analyzed and confirmed to contain remote execution scripts designed to establish temporary encrypted tunnels. Nothing activated because we never inserted it. The attackers had miscalculated one thing. When they increased pressure, my wife insisted on transparency. That decision prevented deeper compromise. But the emotional consequences were still unfolding. One evening, she asked me a question I hadn't expected. Did you ever doubt me? The question felt heavier than any technical report. Yes, I admitted. At first, when I saw the folder, I thought you might be hiding something personal. She nodded slowly. I would have felt the same. We sat in silence for a while. I'm sorry, she said. Not for trying to protect you, but for not trusting you with the truth sooner. I squeezed her hand. If you had told me immediately, they might have escalated faster, I said. You stalled them long enough for us to detect the exploit. Her eyes softened. So I helped in a way? Yes. It was important she heard that, because while she had been manipulated, she had also played a crucial role in exposing the vulnerability. A few weeks later, the vendor responsible for the compromised maintenance window publicly acknowledged a security incident affecting multiple clients. No dramatic headlines, just a technical disclosure. Our company reinforced authentication protocols. Secondary tokens required multi-layer verification. External integrations were tightened. Life began to stabilize again. But something fundamental had shifted between us. We no longer assumed silence meant safety. We communicated everything, even minor uncertainties. It felt uncomfortable at first. Vulnerability always does. But it built a stronger foundation than the illusion of protection ever had. One night, months after everything settled, she looked at me and said, "If I ever think I'm protecting you again, I'll tell you first." I smiled faintly, and I'll listen before assuming. The experience changed how I viewed trust. Not as blind belief, but as active collaboration. The attackers tried to isolate us by turning protection into secrecy. Instead, transparency became our defense. The folder, the messages, the token, they were tools in a strategy meant to divide us. They failed because we chose to face the truth together. In the end, I realized something important. My wife wasn't hiding because she was guilty. She was hiding because she was afraid of losing me. And sometimes fear disguises itself as protection. We survived not because we were perfect, but because once the truth surfaced, we refused to turn against each other. That decision saved more than my job. It saved our marriage. Even after the vendor disclosed the incident, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story was incomplete. The technical explanation made sense. The timeline aligned. The compromised maintenance window explained the secondary token. The phishing infrastructure matched known patterns. On paper, everything was resolved. But emotionally, it felt too clean. My wife noticed it before I did. "You're still thinking about it," she said one evening. We were sitting in the living room, lights dimmed, trying to watch a movie without actually watching it. "I just want to understand why," I replied. "Why us?" "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Maybe it wasn't about us at all." That statement stayed with me. Over the next few days, I started reviewing the logs again, this time with permission from my security lead. I wanted to see the broader picture, not to doubt the conclusion, but to ensure nothing was overlooked. That was when I noticed a pattern I hadn't focused on before. The unauthorized tokens weren't only created during the vendor maintenance window. They were attempted again 2 days later. But those attempts failed. Why would someone try again if the vulnerability had already been exploited? I asked the security team. Their answer was cautious. The second attempts were likely automated, but the timestamps didn't match typical automation cycles. They were spaced deliberately, almost like manual testing. I requested IP tracing details. The source routing bounced through multiple anonymization layers, but one endpoint consistently appeared in the metadata before redirection. A regional data center, not foreign, domestic. That detail shifted the emotional weight of the investigation. It meant whoever initiated this wasn't necessarily an external competitor operating across borders. It could have been someone testing internal defenses from within the same ecosystem. When I shared this with my wife, she went quiet. "What is it?" I asked. She hesitated. One of the contacts I spoke to mentioned something about internal cooperation. I thought it was just corporate language. "What exactly did they say?" She tried to recall the phrasing. It wasn't precise, but it stuck with me. They had implied that certain employees were already collaborating quietly to stabilize systems. That wording had seemed reassuring at the time. Now it felt strategic. If someone wanted to evaluate response speed, they might simulate internal compromise scenarios and observe how quickly employees escalated concerns. Whether they reported independently, whether they shared information with management, whether personal relationships influenced reporting. In other words, the entire situation could have been designed as a behavioral stress test. That idea unsettled me more than the technical breach, because it meant the goal wasn't data theft alone. It was observation. We decided to meet with an independent cybersecurity consultant recommended by my company's legal department, not to reopen the case, but to confirm that our interpretation matched external assessment. The consultant reviewed everything without bias. After 2 meetings, he said something that clarified the situation. "This looks less like targeted espionage," he explained, "and more like infrastructure probing combined with social engineering." "Social engineering against whom?" I asked. "Against whoever was closest to the target." He looked at my wife briefly. "The attackers likely identified you as a high-value access point, not because of your technical role alone, but because of proximity to someone with account privileges." That explanation felt grounded. My wife wasn't chosen because of personal weakness. She was chosen because she had legitimate access pathways that could be exploited emotionally. That distinction mattered. After the consultation, we sat together at home and reviewed everything one final time. "I need to ask you something," I said. "Okay. When they contacted you, did they ever ask you to hide this from me specifically?" She thought carefully. "Yes," she said. "They emphasized discretion. They said if you found out early, you might trigger internal alarms. So secrecy was part of their strategy." She nodded. That confirmed it. The manipulation relied on isolation. They needed her to believe transparency would increase danger. By the time we realized that, we had already disrupted their approach. A month later, my company completed a full audit of third-party integrations. Additional safeguards were implemented. Multi-factor authentication became mandatory across all vendor connections. Monitoring thresholds were tightened. The vulnerability was closed. Life gradually returned to normal routines. But something else changed. Trust between us became deliberate instead of assumed. We started discussing concerns immediately rather than letting them grow silently. If either of us felt uncertain about something, we addressed it directly. One evening, while reviewing household finances, she looked at me and said, "I'm glad you questioned me." Her statement surprised me. "Why?" Because if you hadn't, we wouldn't have discovered the exploit. She was right. If I had accepted the situation at face value, the unauthorized token might have remained active longer. The attackers could have refined their approach. Instead, suspicion led to escalation, and escalation led to detection. What scares me, she added quietly, is how convincing they were. They were professional, I said. That's what made it dangerous. She nodded. We sat there for a while, understanding that the threat had been real, even if the narrative around it had been fabricated. The experience didn't leave us paranoid. It made us precise. Every unexpected request now triggered verification. Every urgent message was cross-checked, not out of fear, but discipline. And slowly, the tension that had filled our home dissolved. The locked drawer in her office stayed open. The metal container in the garage was emptied and repurposed. There were no more secret transfers, no more encrypted channels. What remained was clarity. Looking back, I realized the attackers succeeded in one thing. They forced us to confront how easily love can be weaponized through fear. My wife thought she was shielding me from professional consequences. Instead, she had unknowingly stepped into a structured manipulation designed to isolate us. Once we removed secrecy from the equation, the entire system collapsed. The truth didn't just clear my name. It strengthened our foundation. And that, more than anything, is why I'm grateful the deception failed. Because without it, we might never have learned how important transparency truly is. The calm didn't last because of another attack. It lasted because of something much more ordinary. 3 months after everything, my wife received a formal letter in the mail. Not an email, a physical envelope. It came from a law firm we had never heard of. Inside was a notification referencing the earlier vendor incident. It stated that, as part of an ongoing industry-wide review, certain individuals who had interacted with compromised systems might be contacted for clarification interviews. Her name was listed as a secondary contact in the investigation documentation. We looked at each other across the kitchen table. "They're still tracking this," she said. "No," I replied after reading it carefully. "This is standard procedural cleanup. It's about documentation." But her hands were shaking. Even though we had resolved everything, the memory of manipulation was still close to the surface. We decided to respond formally through my company's legal department instead of engaging directly. They confirmed the letter was legitimate but unrelated to any wrongdoing. It was simply part of compliance tracing connected to the vendor's disclosure. Still, the timing felt deliberate. That evening, my wife admitted something she hadn't told me before. "When they first contacted me," she said, "they didn't just mention your job." I waited. "They asked about our home network." My chest tightened slightly. "What did you tell them?" "I told them we had basic security. Nothing advanced." "Did you ever share passwords?" "No." She shook her head firmly. "I wouldn't do that." I believed her. That had never been in question. But I needed to understand the full extent of their access attempts. "So how did they create the secondary token?" I asked. She explained something she had only recently remembered. During one of their early verification sessions, they had asked her to confirm her identity using a link that simulated a corporate security dashboard. The interface requested multi-step approval, including a push notification. She had received what looked like a legitimate authentication request on her phone. It displayed my company's branding. At the time, she assumed it was related to the supposed audit. "I approved it," she said quietly. "I thought it was harmless." That approval likely allowed the attackers to register a device under her credentials, which they then linked to my account through the compromised maintenance pathway. It wasn't direct hacking. It was layered consent abuse. Once that became clear, the entire structure made sense. They hadn't needed to break in. They needed to be invited in. And they succeeded because they created urgency. We reported the exact interface details to the consultant. Within days, similar phishing simulations were detected targeting other employees' family members across different companies. Not the same firm, but the same design pattern. That confirmed it was a broader campaign. My wife felt less responsible after that discovery. "It wasn't just me," she said. "No," I replied. "It was a method, understanding that helped her release the guilt she had been carrying." But something else emerged during that period. One afternoon, while reviewing archived messages, I noticed that the attackers had asked her a question early on that we had initially overlooked. They asked whether I had access to privileged test environments outside standard monitoring hours. At the time, she didn't understand why that mattered. Now it was obvious. They were mapping access behavior. If I had responded defensively or contacted internal teams without documentation, it would have signaled certain escalation patterns. Instead, by following protocol, we forced them into exposure. Our measured response limited their options. Weeks later, my security lead informed me that the anonymized IP clusters linked to the attempted token registrations had been associated with multiple failed social engineering attempts across different sectors. No confirmed data breaches were traced back to them. That meant their campaign relied heavily on psychological pressure rather than technical intrusion. They exploited trust. When I shared this with my wife, she looked relieved but thoughtful. They almost made me feel like I was the only one who could fix it, she said. That's how manipulation works, I replied. It isolates responsibility. We sat quietly after that. For the first time since the incident began, there was no tension in the room. Not because we forgot what happened, but because we understood it completely. The fear had been real. The vulnerability had been real. But the narrative had been engineered. And once we identified that, it lost its power. That night, my wife said something that stayed with me. If I had kept hiding, they would have had more control. Yes, I agreed. And if you hadn't questioned me, we would never have found it. Yes. We both recognized that the crisis only resolved because we were willing to face discomfort. Trust didn't mean blind acceptance. It meant verification without accusation. The experience changed how we handle uncertainty. When something feels off now, we discuss it immediately. No assumptions. No silent processing. No internalizing fear. The lesson was simple but powerful. Secrecy can be weaponized. Transparency cannot. In trying to shield me from consequences that never existed, my wife had unknowingly stepped into a structured manipulation campaign. But once we confronted it together, the structure collapsed. There was no hidden criminal charge, no internal suspicion, no personal betrayal, just a sophisticated attempt to create confusion. And we survived it because we chose clarity over fear. After everything settled, I expected life to feel completely normal again. It didn't. Not because of danger, but because of awareness. We had closed the vulnerabilities. The vendor incident was resolved. The phishing infrastructure was blocked across multiple networks. My company's systems were reinforced. On paper, the situation was over. But trust, once tested, doesn't return to its original shape. It evolves. One evening, about 2 months after the final audit, my wife came home later than usual. She looked tired but calm. There was a security workshop at the hospital, she said. They talked about social engineering. I smiled slightly. Perfect timing. She sat beside me and continued. They said attackers often target family members first, not employees. That's accurate, I replied. She nodded. They explained how urgency and secrecy are used together. I could see she was processing the information deeply. I keep thinking, she said slowly. What if I had insisted on keeping it private? What if I had refused to escalate? Then we might still be guessing, I answered honestly. She was quiet for a moment. I was scared, she admitted. Not of losing money, of losing you. That statement carried more weight than anything else in the entire situation. I know, I said. And that's why you reacted the way you did. She looked at me carefully. Do you regret how you handled it? I shook my head. No, but I regret that we were forced into that position. The truth was, neither of us had failed. We had both acted under incomplete information. She believed silence was protection. I believed transparency was necessary. The attackers relied on that gap. Later that night, I reviewed something one final time, the timeline. From initial contact to escalation, the pattern followed 3 stages. First, credibility establishment. Professional tone, realistic documentation, plausible vulnerability references. Second, controlled pressure. Urgency, implied consequences, structured instructions. Third, behavioral monitoring. Attempts to see how we responded, whether we isolated, escalated, or complied. Once we escalated correctly, their leverage evaporated. It wasn't heroic. It was procedural, and that realization made me calm. A few weeks later, my wife received another message, this time from an unknown number. It contained only one line. You handled that well. No threats. No demands. We reported it immediately. Security confirmed it was likely a residual monitoring attempt, but the infrastructure behind it was inactive. It didn't lead anywhere. Still, the message confirmed something important. They were watching reactions, not just systems. That understanding changed how we think about digital interactions now. We don't panic. We verify. We also changed something at home. We created a shared digital log for anything unusual: emails, calls, system notifications. Not because we expect danger, but because documentation prevents confusion. It's simple, transparent, mutual. One evening, while organizing files together, my wife paused and said, "I'm glad you didn't assume the worst." I did at first, I admitted. But I asked questions instead of making accusations. That made the difference, she said. She was right. If I had reacted with anger instead of investigation, the situation could have fractured our trust permanently. Instead, we treated the problem as external, not personal. That distinction saved us. Looking back, the most dangerous part of the entire experience wasn't the exploit or the fake tokens. It was the moment when secrecy almost became normal. If we had continued hiding information from each other, even with good intentions, the attackers would have succeeded indirectly. Isolation is powerful. Collaboration is stronger. Now, when something feels uncertain, we sit down and analyze it together. Not emotionally first, logically first, then emotionally. The difference is clarity. My wife once thought protection required silence. She learned that protection requires partnership. And I learned that suspicion, when handled responsibly, can prevent harm instead of causing it. There was no dramatic arrest, no public scandal, no criminal mastermind revealed. Just a structured vulnerability exploited by professionals who underestimated communication. In the end, the truth wasn't explosive. It was stabilizing. Our marriage didn't survive because we ignored the fear. It survived because we confronted it together. The experience left scars, but they're not fractures. They're reminders. Reminders that transparency is not weakness. It is security. And that sometimes, the most powerful protection isn't hiding something. It's sharing everything.